This is one of the most important pieces of information Activision has given us about Call of Duty's matchmaking. It allows us to more precisely pick it apart, and it directly quotes the patented software that we have been constantly investigating Activision's usage of, which essentially confirms its usage in-game. This is actually huge, and the fact that these public statements from Activision line up perfectly with the patents is no coincidence. Strap in. Take a look at this quote. "To be sure we're providing the players with the best in-match experience, we pay close attention to a blend of matchmaking-focused key performance indicators, or KPIs, such as delta ping, which we've discussed earlier, lobby and match fullness, skill disparity, match outcome metrics, and search time, as well as more player-focused KPIs, including hours per user, HPU, lobby quit rates, player retention/churn, and player survey results. These metrics are not used directly as inputs to the matchmaking selection algorithm, but are observable outcomes that tell us if our matchmaking approach is working in the eyes of our players." This is basically just a whole collection of metrics and factors that they use to measure player satisfaction and engagement with the matchmaking that they're using. By using things they call KPIs, or key performance indicators, they can measure the engagement and satisfaction of a player. KPIs are exactly what they sound like they are. They are values that are measured regarding us players as individuals that measure our overall satisfaction with a particular match that we play, including more personal factors like how often you quit out of a lobby early out of frustration, and how positively or negatively you respond to surveys. Now, why is measuring player satisfaction insanely important, besides the obvious fact that Activision wants to retain players? Well, it obviously circles back to money. And how do they make more money than just the money from the $70 sale price? Microtransactions within the game. The more players that play and are satisfied with the game, the more likely that they will have players spending money on microtransactions. Activision's entire business model and the way they run the game revolves around players buying microtransactions when you really think about it. It's the only way to make money outside of the original purchase price. The entire game purely revolves around how can we get more people to buy microtransactions. This is their entire business plan. If they mix bad players with good players, they potentially risk the bad players quitting and not buying microtransactions. If players consistently perform poorly, it risks them quitting and not buying microtransactions. If players don't have enough of a challenge to the point where it's boring, they risk quitting and they risk not buying microtransactions. If there isn't enough content in a season, they risk quitting and not buying microtransactions. Everything risks quitting, which then risks not buying microtransactions. And the Call of Duty team is actively trying to make the game behave in such a way that gives us the least chance of quitting. However, because they're catering to the majority, the casual fan base, the more serious, higher skilled fan base of the game that is passionate about it is getting the short end of the stick. Microtransactions drive the game, and they want the majority, the casuals, to think that bundles are cool, that they're worthwhile, and that the game they purchased those cosmetics for is worth playing. Hence most of their matchmaking and potential game rigging practices. It's all in favor of the worst players. Now, here's where we start to do some digging. How many of these metrics mentioned measure player engagement? 1, 2, 3, 4. Match outcome metrics, which determines how well a player does, and as a result gauges if they're happy or aggravated. Hours per user, how long each player has been playing. Player retention and churn rates, seeing if anybody quit out of Call of Duty because that particular match was aggravating. And player survey results, all measure engagement and satisfaction. The more aggravating a match, the less they play, the more they back out of matches, and the more negative the outcomes and survey results, the less engaged Activision can assume a certain player is. The more hours they play, the more positive their results. The less they quit, and the more positively players respond to surveys, the more engaged Activision can assume a player is. This being said, they've admitted fully that player engagement is tracked and taken into account when it comes to their matchmaking. Now, I'm not sure if you remember or not, but Activision actually denied using a player's time played in their matchmaking in the first matchmaking blog post. Additionally, they redefined the term engagement to mean the amount a particular player has played, instead of the real kind of engagement measured in EOMM, which is the level of investment the player has in the game. So they deny measuring time played, yet here they 100% fully admit to using hours per user when determining the satisfaction score for a match, and they also have 4 factors that measure player engagement. So there's definitely a reason they didn't deny using real engagement, but it's also kind of strange that they just admitted to using something that they denied using a little earlier this year. Now, if this were just a fully innocent practice, I wouldn't blame a company for doing this. If I owned a company, I'd make sure to have a way to find out if my customers were engaged and satisfied, obviously. You may think that this may may even be a great thing, because if Activision can measure a player's engagement, they'll be able to give them a super engaging, positive experience where they're never losing, never performing poorly, and always having fun on the game. But we must remember that this isn't the case, and that this is a competitive game. One team is always trying to beat the other. When one team wins, another loses. When one player gets a kill, another one dies. This is where the problems start emerging. You simply cannot afford to always give a player positive results. Sure, winning consecutively and getting lots of kills per game and leveling up fast is what's going to keep players the most engaged in the game. However, when this happens, we also have to keep in mind that given that COD is a game where players play against each other, everything positive that happens for one player is happening as a direct result of them causing something negative to happen to another player, like eliminating them or beating their team. In order for the game to be fully fair in the eyes of the corporation that owns it, players need to have an experience that is satisfying enough to keep them playing, but not so aggravating that they quit. In order to do this, they establish some form of universal fairness, in heavy quotation marks, for their entire player base. A perfect example is that in their original Matchmaking Intel blog post, they wrote, "All players, regardless of skill level, are more likely to experience wins and losses more proportionately." Right here is proof enough that something is going on, beyond just players getting matched purely based on connection, or purely based on matching time, or even purely based on skill. In this line that Activision wrote themselves, it's shown that they intend players to experience wins and losses more proportionately, and these KPIs that they use to track engagement help them to measure whether or not this system is working. If even a small demographic of players experience wins more than they lose, or experience good games more than they experience bad games, that means that the other players they're playing against have more frequent negative experiences. In theory, allowing one player to win more than they lose means that somewhere else in the player base, another player is losing more than they win. In the context of assessing player satisfaction, they are logically better off making sure both players have an equal experience, versus sacrificing one just to secure the other. Remember, I said earlier, in a competitive game like Call of Duty, to have something positive happen to you, you have to cause something negative to happen to somebody else. But that's just the nature of the beast, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That's just the nature of competition. This is where I have trouble understanding exactly what they're saying here, and it sounds like doublespeak. They say they use these factors to measure whether or not a player's match experience will be satisfactory or not, but then immediately says afterwards that they're not used in the matchmaking selection algorithm. So what gives here? They say they use it, and then they say they don't. Well, let's consider the fact that whatever a matchmaking selection algorithm is, it's different from the actual matchmaking algorithm that places you into your matches. It's an algorithm that describes what type of matchmaking you experience, hence it being called matchmaking selection. It's selecting your matchmaking experience. Is it going to be mostly based on connection, skill, engagement? Perhaps it prioritizes certain factors depending on the kind of player that you are. We can speculate that perhaps different player demographics experience different types of matchmaking, and there's an ultimate algorithm that selects the particular matchmaking experience for you, hence a matchmaking selection algorithm. Regardless, we know that these KPIs are measured and taken into account directly when matchmaking for a few reasons. Firstly, we know that skill disparity is 100% being measured because they said it themselves. Match outcomes like wins, losses, and stats are also being measured, and they've also said that themselves. They want wins and losses to be more proportional, so they obviously track those when matchmaking. And outcomes like kill-death ratio and average score per minute are included within the skill measurement, so we know that these are also tracked. Delta ping, as they've defined here, is obviously measured when you queue up for a match because you need to find a match that has a reasonable connection to you. You can't be playing on a server that has too high of a ping value, and this entire research paper is telling us about how they prioritize delta ping, so it's clearly measured when matchmaking. However, besides proving that these factors are actually used within the matchmaking process, as in they're directly accessed and used to find you a match when you hit search, the next few KPIs, which are referred to as player-focused KPIs, are the biggest piece of evidence we have that Activision are actually using their patented software, and not just ignorantly letting it sit there. Let me read this quote again. As well as more player-focused KPIs, including hours per user, lobby quit rates, player retention/churn, and player survey results. Now, take a look at this excerpt from the Activision-owned patent. Examples of quality factors include, without limitation, a player quitting a match or gameplay session while other players are still playing, indicating satisfaction, a duration of a game session, e.g. a longer duration may indicate greater satisfaction, a gameplay performance factor, e.g. a kill-to-death ratio in a shooter game, a lap time in a racing game, etc., where greater performance may indicate greater satisfaction, a player engagement factor, e.g. a speed of player input, a level of focus as determined from camera peripherals, etc., where greater engagement may indicate greater satisfaction, a competition level of a game, e.g. whether lopsided or not, where evenly matched games may indicate greater satisfaction, a biometric factor, e.g. facial expressions, pulse, body language, sweat, etc., explicit feedback from a player, e.g. responses to a survey, and or other observable metrics related to gameplay. Now, do you see where these two line up? It's right there. This information in their official research paper that they published is directly referenced in the patent. Let's compare factors and see how many are similar. You can see that they admit that they track hours per user, the duration of a play session, quitting early out of a game that hasn't finished, survey results, performance or outcomes, and the level of competition, which is skill disparity. So we have at least 5 things that they admit they track that literally exactly line up with their patented software that is meant to sell you microtransactions and keep you engaged. Not to mention that this patent has the same objective as the system they're describing within the research paper. They're both with the intention of gauging player satisfaction and engagement. However, while the research paper dances around the true implications of these measurements, the patent can give us some insight. First, we have to wonder, why would Activision track player satisfaction and engagement unless they had a system that dynamically adapted to a player's measured satisfaction level? They're not just using the system to see if their matchmaking works, as they've implied. They can't even say that these metrics aren't used when matchmaking. They use another term, matchmaking selection process. Let's refer to the patent to perhaps see how these factors are used. And let me tell you, this excerpt right here says it all. If a player has been performing poorly, e.g. getting killed at a rate higher than the player's historical rate, the scoring engine may dynamically adjust one or more coefficients to match the player in a game that will improve the player's performance. For example, the player may be matched with easier opponents, matched with better teammates, and or placed in a game that is more tailored to the player's preferences. E.g. players that play in games more closely aligned with their preferences tend to perform better. That sounds like EOMM. So right here, this all circles back to catering to the casual fan base, making sure that if a player has a poor performance, they compensate for it by throwing them easier matches that are more compatible for them. Why does this help them? Well, it's also depicted in the patent how player satisfaction is measured, and it is also detailed in some way within this paper about how ping factors into matchmaking. Activision measures player satisfaction in order to retain players by adjusting their matchmaking based on the measurements of that particular player's satisfaction and engagement level. It's right here in writing in both documents. This is exactly what EOMM is, adjusting your matchmaking based on your engagement. It's engagement optimized. Not only do these two documents line up perfectly in their description of how player satisfaction is measured, the patent does this one better by also explaining how this data is used. It is directly used to determine matches for the player to ensure they don't quit the game, which, as I said earlier, increases the chances they buy microtransactions. A patent like the one for their microtransaction engine, which is actually their biggest help in pushing players to buy microtransactions using that technology, would be assumed to accurately detail all of their practices regarding the relationship between microtransactions and matchmaking. It's all designed to push microtransactions. And before anyone hits me with, well, Pete, just because it's patented doesn't mean it's in use, which I get way too much, just think with your brain for a second. Basic logic tells us that the way Activision makes money on the game outside of the purchase price is microtransactions. That's indisputable. Buying in-game content. That's the only way. They have a patent that not only complements that goal perfectly and details every last method they use to push these microtransactions, which is obviously in their best financial interest as a business, it also exactly lines up with a paper that they wrote and published, including the same engagement factors that they use to measure player satisfaction. This is no coincidence. This is one of the first times where something they've admitted to actually perfectly lines up with methods described within the patents. So my point being, these KPIs that they measure play more of a role than just being there for measurement. They are there so that your matchmaking experience can be tailored and personalized to keep you engaged in the game. This, along with them admitting that they want players to experience wins and losses more proportionately, may lead us to believe that the matchmaking is something far beyond skill-based, and I think it's fairly obvious that it's way past that. If it uses factors to measure engagement, then tries to throw us into a match to maximize our engagement and satisfaction, it sounds like the matchmaking is more engagement optimized than skill-based. I'll leave you with this final quote from the patent that we've at this point basically justified as in full use. Furthermore, conventional systems, which I'm sure means things like connection and skill-based matchmaking, as this was originally written in 2015, failed to assess a quality of gameplay used to tune matchmaking processes to optimize player combinations. Interesting choice of words there. Conventional systems also failed to reserve gameplay sessions for players in a way that minimizes the time that a player must wait to be matched. Conventional systems further failed to leverage matchmaking processes in other contexts, such as influencing game-related purchases, which is exactly what I've been saying they're trying to do, suggesting group formations, training/identifying non-player characters, Wait, training NPCs? Wasn't there something going around about NPCs? What do they mean training? Could they be AI? Who knows? And or otherwise extending the use of the matchmaking process. These and other drawbacks exist with the current matchmaking processes used in multiplayer video games. Basically, this provides a critique of 2015's matchmaking processes and says that whatever this patent details is far more effective in optimizing the player experience and pushing microtransactions, which is their ultimate goal. And the way they do that is to drive player engagement. And to think we got all of that just because these two sections lined up perfectly with each other. Activision admitting they track these metrics in a matchmaking-focused context lets us know that there are more factors than just skill and connection being measured. And that means this is no longer skill-based matchmaking. It's engagement-optimized matchmaking. What do you think about this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, but I'm going to leave you with that. I'm Prime Pete. Take it easy.